The silent neighbor. Tom had always been a good neighbor. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other, he made it a point to be friendly, even if he wasn't particularly close with everyone. His closest neighbor was an elderly woman named Mrs. Hudson. She had lived in her house for as long as Tom could remember, long before he and his wife moved in 5 years ago. Mrs. Hudson was a widow and a bit of a recluse. Tom would see her occasionally tending to her garden or taking out the trash, but she was always alone. She didn't have any visitors, and her family, if she had any, never came around. Despite her solitude, she seemed to be doing well for her age. She moved around slowly but steadily, and her house, though old, was well kept. As the years went by, Tom noticed that Mrs. Hudson's appearances became less frequent. The once meticulously cared for garden began to wither, and the trash cans were left out for days at a time. Tom grew concerned, but whenever he knocked on her door to check on her, there was no answer. He would leave a note, but it was never acknowledged. One particularly cold winter, Tom realized he hadn't seen Mrs. Hudson for several weeks. Her lights would come on in the evening, and the faint sound of her television could be heard, but there was no other sign of life. He mentioned his concern to his wife, who suggested calling the police for a welfare check. Reluctantly, Tom agreed. When the police arrived, they knocked on the door several times. After receiving no response, they forced the door open. Tom, standing on his porch, watched as the officers entered the house. A few moments later, one of them emerged with a grim look on his face. They asked Tom to stay back as they continued their investigation. The following day, Tom learned that Mrs. Hudson had been dead for at least 3 months. She had died peacefully in her living room chair, her body facing the television, which was still on, showing static. The cause of death was determined to be natural, likely a heart attack. What disturbed Tom the most was that despite her death, the lights in her house had been turning on and off at night, and the television had been changing channels. The police checked for any signs of tampering or a break-in but found nothing. The neighborhood was shaken by the news. The idea that Mrs. Hudson had been dead for so long, yet her house seemed alive, was terrifying. Tom tried to rationalize it. Maybe the lights were on a timer, and perhaps the TV remote had fallen into the couch, causing it to switch channels randomly. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. A few weeks after Mrs. Hudson's body was taken away, Tom began to hear strange noises coming from her house late at night. It started with faint whispers and grew louder, sounding like someone moving furniture or knocking on the walls. One night, Tom woke up to the sound of a television blaring from next door. He looked out his window and saw the flickering blue light of Mrs. Hudson's TV shining through her curtains. Panicked, Tom called the police again. They arrived quickly, but once inside the house they found nothing. The television was off, and there was no one inside. The house was empty. The officers reassured Tom that everything was fine, but he could see the unease in their eyes. The noises continued for weeks, and Tom's sleep was plagued by nightmares. He began to avoid walking past Mrs. Hudson's house, and when he did, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. One night, as he was lying in bed, he heard a loud crash from next door, followed by the sound of shuffling feet. Gathering his courage, Tom grabbed a flashlight and went outside to investigate. As he approached Mrs. Hudson's house, he noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. The lights were off, but the television's glow was visible through the window. Tom's heart pounded as he pushed the door open further, calling out to see if anyone was there. The house was cold and smelled of decay. He shined his flashlight around the living room, and to his horror, he saw Mrs. Hudson's chair facing the television, just as it had been when they found her body. But this time, the chair was empty. Tom froze, his mind racing. The television flickered, and the static-filled screen seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. As he backed away, something caught his eye, a figure standing in the hallway, shrouded in darkness. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. Tom's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly raised its arm and pointed directly at him. Without thinking, Tom turned and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind him. He didn't stop until he was back inside his own home, locking the doors and windows. He didn't sleep at all that night, and the next day he contacted a real estate agent to put his house on the market. Tom moved out within a month. He never spoke of the incident to anyone, not even his wife. The new owners of Mrs. Hudson's house never reported anything unusual, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something that was still watching him, waiting for him to return. 2. The haunted bunker. During World War II, a group of Allied soldiers was stationed at an isolated bunker deep in the dense forests of Germany. The bunker had been a strategic point for the Nazis, and rumors swirled about the horrific experiments conducted there. The locals spoke of the screams that echoed through the woods at night and the strange lights that flickered in the sky. The soldiers, hardened by war, dismissed these tales as mere superstition, but they couldn't ignore the unsettling atmosphere that surrounded the place. The bunker was a maze of narrow corridors, dimly lit by flickering bulbs. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and rusting metal. The soldiers, led by Sergeant Jameson, set up their quarters in one of the larger rooms, while a few of them were assigned to patrol the perimeter. The days passed slowly, filled with the monotony of guard duty and maintenance work. One evening, as the sun set behind the thick trees, casting long shadows over the bunker, Private Thompson, who was on patrol duty, heard something strange. It was a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, coming from deep within the woods. He paused, straining his ears to catch the noise again, but all he heard was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, he continued his patrol, but the sense of being watched never left him. That night, as the soldiers gathered around a small fire inside the bunker, Thompson mentioned the noise to his comrades. Most of them laughed it off, teasing him for being jumpy. But Sergeant Jameson, a man known for his no-nonsense attitude, took it seriously. He had served in several haunted locations during the war and knew better than to dismiss strange occurrences. The next day, Jameson ordered a thorough search of the surrounding woods. The soldiers spread out, combing the area for any signs of enemy activity or hidden traps. They found nothing out of the ordinary, just the dense forest and the occasional wildlife. But as they regrouped to head back to the bunker, Corporal Jenkins noticed something odd. A section of the ground near the bunker's entrance looked disturbed, as if it had been recently dug up and then hastily covered again. Curiosity piqued, the soldiers began to dig. After a few minutes, they uncovered a small, rusted metal box. It was locked, and the key was nowhere to be found. Jameson, determined to find out what was inside, pried it open with a knife. Inside the box were several documents, yellowed with age, and a small, weathered journal. The documents were written in German and seemed to be official military records, but it was the journal that caught Jameson's attention. The journal belonged to a German scientist named Dr. Klaus Fischer, who had been stationed at the bunker during the war. As Jameson flipped through the pages, he realized that the journal detailed the experiments conducted in the bunker. Fischer had been working on something called Project Shadow, an attempt to harness supernatural forces as a weapon. The experiments involved summoning and controlling entities from another realm, creatures of darkness that fed on fear and suffering. The journal entries became increasingly erratic as Fischer described the horrors that unfolded in the bunker. The entities, once summoned, were uncontrollable. They slaughtered the prisoners used in the experiments and then turned on the scientists. Fischer's final entry was a desperate plea for help, but it was clear that no one had come to his aid. The journal ended abruptly, with a smear of what looked like dried blood on the last page. Jameson shared the journal with his men, and the atmosphere in the bunker grew tense. The soldiers, who had once scoffed at the idea of ghosts and demons, now found themselves on edge, constantly looking over their shoulders. That night, they heard the growl again, but this time it was closer, echoing through the corridors of the bunker. As the night wore on, the soldiers began to experience strange occurrences. The lights flickered on and off, the temperature dropped suddenly, and they heard faint whispers in a language none of them could understand. One of the men, Private Harris, claimed to have seen a shadowy figure standing at the end of a hallway, watching him with glowing red eyes. The others dismissed it as a trick of the light, but the fear in Harris's eyes was real. The situation escalated the following night. As the soldiers tried to sleep, they were jolted awake by the sound of metal scraping against concrete. The noise seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the bunker like a sinister symphony. Jameson and his men grabbed their weapons and cautiously made their way through the corridors, searching for the source of the sound. They found nothing, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more frantic. The soldiers were on the verge of panic when the lights suddenly went out, plunging the bunker into complete darkness. In the pitch black, they heard the growl again, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from the depths of the bunker. Jameson ordered his men to retreat to the main room and set up a defensive perimeter. They huddled together, their guns trained on the entrance, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then, the door creaked open, and a cold breeze swept through the room. In the dim light of their flashlights, the soldiers saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow pits of darkness, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the terror it was causing. The soldiers opened fire, but their bullets seemed to pass right through the creature. It continued to advance, unfazed by the barrage of gunfire. Panic set in as the men realized they were powerless against it. The creature reached out with a bony hand, its fingers curling around the air, as if it were grasping something invisible. Suddenly, the creature stopped, its grin fading. It turned its head slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. Then, without warning, it let out a bone-chilling screech and vanished into thin air. The lights flickered back on, and the scraping sound ceased. The soldiers were left in stunned silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had survived, but the horror of what they had seen would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Jameson, shaken but determined, ordered his men to pack up and leave the bunker at first light. As they made their way out of the forest, they could still hear the faint echoes of that terrible growl, following them into the night. The bunker was abandoned after that, left to rot in the middle of the forest. It became a place of legend, a haunted relic of a dark past that few dared to approach. The soldiers who survived never spoke of what they saw, but the memories lingered, a reminder that some horrors cannot be explained, only endured.